Fill her up.
You're listening to the Gas Digital Network.
Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us, straight from DC, just got off the train, Corey DeAngelis. You are the executive director at the Educational Freedom Institute, adjunct scholar at Cato, and you also work with Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So thank you for not having the bow tie on like you have on in Twitter, which I've given you crap about, which I find very problematic. And you also have Milton Friedman as your banner photo, but okay, we have had Stalin.
Hey, we've talked a little bit about how I like David Friedman a little more than Milton.
Then why is Milton on your banner?
Well, Milton was just he kind of introduced me to all of this stuff, but then I got a little more deep into the weeds, and David Friedman is my new true hero now. But yeah, and Milton Friedman was just a better communicator than David. I love David's talks on YouTube, but Milton had a good way of relaying his arguments to the general public, which I like that about him.
Yeah, Stalinists like Friedman are really good at giving speeches and moving crowds. So he's had a long history of that. He's given us income tax withholding. He's a big defender of rent control as a right of the government, just maybe inefficient. So yeah, but David is better in many ways.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I like Milton's way of communicating. That doesn't mean I agree with every single policy that he advanced. But, my background's in school choice. So Milton had a really good history with relaying the arguments for school choice as well with his 1955 essay, The Role of Government in Education. So that's another reason why I like Milton Friedman as well.
So you're a bit of a beast on Twitter. Because
not like you. I mean, you have 103,000 followers now. I just checked it on my phone. I'm only at 13,000. So I'm chasing you.
Okay.
Keep retweeting my stuff, and I'll be able to catch up.
Thanks for that Rain Man update. He knows the exact
number. It's right
here. No. What I meant not in terms of audience. Are you even verified?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I'm not verified on Instagram, and a certain Frankenstein's monster who works at this network and owns this network is as of this week, and I'm very upset about it.
Well, and there's a lot of people on Twitter that have, like 1,000 followers, and they're already verified.
Well, you know why?
I think an easy way to get verified on Twitter is to just run for office. And so if you run for office, you're a public figure, and you can easily get verified that way.
Here's the other trick, is if you have some newspaper email, and you email them, that was a way to get verified, and it's very smart corporate policy because now you have those journos have a sense of validation. And they're going to be probably more positive toward Twitter in their writing, and this is why there's so much blue check overrepresentation of journalist class.
I noticed that as well. Whenever I get into an argument with a journalist about a false claim, I know you've retweeted some of my arguments there.
False claim. See, this is where we're having an argument. Okay.
So I know you take issue with sometimes I'll say it's a false claim, and then I like to say it's a lie after they know that's the truth.
Yes.
and that if I have engaged with them and they still don't correct it, or if they acknowledge that they said this, then I think it becomes a lie when the motive is clear. But until then, I always like to
that's fair
stay back and say this is just a false statement, misleading claim, and then but yeah, I mean I think you are right that a lot of this is blatant misinformation, lying.
Or it could be misinformation that they're uninformed and are uninterested in becoming informed. I mean, that I think happens very frequently.
Yeah, you have a narrative that you want to push. You've heard people say whatever about education spending. So the most recent one was the Washington Post, where the dean of an education school, UVA's Curry School of Education, made the claim that since the late 1980s, that real funding for schools adjusted for inflation has decreased, but that's not actually true. It took them 8 days to correct it, which It's way longer than I would like for something like as big as the Washington Post to take on that. And look, this is the dean of an education school. He should have known better.
He did know better.
Hey, look, it's either huge incompetence, and he shouldn't have been in this position the first place, or you would think if you're in this position, the facts, right?
If you don't know the facts, you look them up before you run your mouth. If you're
definitely.
the dean of an education school and you're talking to the Washington fucking Post, you have to make sure that everything you're saying is accurate and factual. And beforehand, you do your homework. And if you don't know it at the time, say, I'll get back to you. And you get back to them. So this is, even if it's very possible he was mistaken at first, but then you're being sloppy and irresponsible.
Well, and then another whole point is that the editors should check this before they run the piece, and it shouldn't take someone like me blasting them on Twitter for them to make a correction and emailing them over this issue and giving them all the facts, and then it takes them 8 days to correct it. This should have never happened in the first place. They should have vetted the facts and all these basics.
See, what's amazing about the conversation about public schools and school choice, and we're going to get into that right now, is it would be one thing if they said value judgments. For example, we don't value our public schools enough. People don't respect school teachers enough. There's not enough resources, where it's ambiguous, right? Like these are nebulous expressions, and you can easily back up any of those statements. Mm-hmm. When you're making a concrete, factual, data-based claim, and the data, no matter how you spin it, is contrary to that, there is something very, very wrong. Because he specifically, see, what someone can do, and take it out of school choice, can say, oh, the numbers increase, but that's accounting for inflation. He even says,
adjusting for inflation, right? And no matter how you split it, like you said, whether you took it state level funding, federal level funding, local level funding, whether you looked at per capita, per pupil funding, or just overall funding, adjusted or not for inflation, no matter how you looked at it, the best case scenario to defend his claim is that since the late 1980s, per pupil inflation adjusted spending has increased by around 36%. You can't spin it any other way, no matter how you look at the data. And the Washington Post correction was actually pretty embarrassing, because they even wrote that. They said no matter how the data are sliced, they didn't say it exactly in those words, but they said whether you look at federal, state, or local, it's increased over this time period. It should have been a retraction in my view, because that was the whole point of the article. We haven't tried this before. We haven't tried to spend more money, but we have. Year after year, we increase spending, and especially if you look back since 1989 or any year in the 1980s. But you're right that we need to be able to agree on a basic set of facts. There's room for tons of disagreement in the debate for education policy and school choice, but there's just no room at all for just making stuff up or misrepresenting basic facts about education spending. Yeah, we can argue about whether how much we've increased is not enough, or whether that's too much, or whether the money has mattered in the past, or if it hasn't. We can argue those things all day, but what we can't do is just make up data and make claims like that, saying that the spending has gone down when it actually hasn't.
So how did you get involved in this particular issue?
I actually attended a school of choice in high school. It was a government-run magnet school. So
a school of choice?
Yeah,
that sounds like you were a dropout.
So yeah, whenever I mention a school of choice, that is a school that I'm not residentially assigned to. So
interesting.
This is how I define school choice. It's any mechanism that gets you away from that residentially assigned monopoly system that we have in the current education system. So I was residentially assigned to one school that was not a very good school. And in my district in San Antonio, Texas, I had a choice of 4 different magnet schools that I could attend. They weren't private schools. They were still government run, but they all had their own specialization. And I got to pick, one of those 4 schools, and I got in the one that I wanted to go to. It had selective admissions, but and also lottery-based admissions as well. And just seeing the difference of my magnet school and the school I was supposed to go to really opened my eyes up to this idea of school choice, and how your zip code shouldn't determine your future when it comes to education. And that's exactly what we have in the current education system. And then I also did my bachelor's and master's in economics. And my advisor at the University of Texas at San Antonio over all these years, his name's Dr. John Merrifield. And he was a big school choice researcher. He still does some school choice research, and he kind of advised me throughout my whole time there and introduced me to voucher programs and the ideas behind school choice. And then after that, his recommendation was to go to the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD under Patrick Wolf and Jay Green, who are two big school choice researchers. And I, did a lot of studies with them, primarily Patrick Wolf. And so I've loved the work ever since. It's been a lot of fun.
One of the things I constantly talk about, the people who I most kind of try to reach out to and who I disagree with the most are people who are what is colloquially known as black-pilled, who think things are hopeless. And what I always point out is social media. If I have 1,000 people lying, it takes just one person with data, and it doesn't have to say this is my point of view. Here's the numbers, and it's 1,000 to 1. The person's going to win. It's going to be David versus Goliath. So some of the things you've done on Twitter have been so much punching above your weight and just absolutely phenomenal. My favorite was, and because I've done this myself, no one does the homework. Like conservatives, something I really resent with them is ostensibly conservatism is about looking at the lessons of history and applying them to today. And I've been the only one reading these books from the early 1900s about the early progressive texts, what they advocated for. So when conservatives are like, oh, things went bad in the 60s, I'm like, this has been 100 years. Here's Bernays, here's Walter Lippmann, and so on and so forth. I want to hear what you did to Chief Elizabeth Warren. Because that was
I didn't know what you were going to bring up, but I've almost forgot about the Elizabeth Warren stuff. It's
wonderful.
Been so much, hypocrite after hypocrite exposing on social media, but it's all started with Elizabeth Warren.
Let me interrupt you, because one of the things Elizabeth Warren says on her campaign trail, which I think is a lie, is she said, when I was a kid, I wanted to grow up and be a public school teacher. When you are a kid, you don't make those distinctions. You say teacher. No one.
She's pandering to the teachers.
Right. No one as a kid thinks I specifically want to teach as a public school.
So she came out with her education plan in October, and it was one of the most radically anti-school choice education plans out there as far as the Democratic frontrunners. Some would say it's actually worse than the Bernie Sanders education plan. But she called to end federal funding of charter schools. She called to make it more difficult to open public charter schools. She called to end tax credit scholarships and voucher programs.
What are tax credit scholarships?
Yeah, it's kind of like a voucher program. The whole Milton Friedman idea is you opt out of that residentially assigned school and you get to pick a private school of choice, and you can take some of the dollars that would have went to your public school or government school, whatever you want to call it. I like to call it government school. We can talk a little bit about why in a second. But you could take you already know what I'm saying. But you can take some of that money to a private school of choice. With a tax credit scholarship, the funding is private still, because individual households, corporations, and just individuals in general can donate to something called a scholarship granting organization. And individual families can go to that scholarship granting organization and apply to get scholarship funding.
So let me interrupt you. So I'm Bill Gates. I set up some foundation. Then Corey's poor. Yep. Right. And he's got a kid. He goes to the Bill Gates Education Foundation. Bill Gates says, hey, your kid has promise. Here's a check. You take that check and you take it to a private school. At no point is this government money. However, it's often, we're going to get to that in a second, it's often spun as if this is government money, correct?
Yes, and I just had a huge, argument with reporters in Florida at the Orlando Sentinel, arguing that donations, voluntary private donations to a scholarship granting organization, they argue that they were public dollars or taxpayer dollars, in which I replied that no, these are private dollars. If you look at the Florida courts, they've ruled this way. They said that the tax credit scholarship program in Florida involves no public funds. But the U.S. Supreme Court ruled this way as well in 2011, saying that, I think it's ACSTO versus Wynn, 2011. It's a Supreme Court case if you want to look it up. But the main quote there was that private funds remain private until they they come into the tax collector's hands. So, and this was about a tax credit scholarship program as well.
So is their argument that let's suppose Bill Gates' money would have been tax money, so therefore since it hasn't become tax money, it's effectively public?
Yeah, and the logical conclusion, if you follow that line of reasoning, is that all money belongs to the government.
Right.
There is no such thing as private dollars, because you can make the argument following that same line of reasoning that, well, we could have taxed you at 90%, but we're only taxing you at 30%. So, your private dollars are public dollars.
Or I
because
could have bought this
or if you-
orange juice and paid sales tax. I didn't. Well, therefore, 8% of my money is government money.
Yeah, because that could have went to the government,
Right.
right? And so, I mean, the Supreme Court has consistently ruled on this at the U.S. Supreme Court level, but then also at the courts in the U.S. individual states have also consistently ruled this way as well. But let's get back to the Warren story really quickly. But yeah, she called for all this anti-school choice stuff in her education plan. And then she also was going off on Twitter and other forms of social media. She even started a new hashtag public school proud. And she was talking about how she's so public school proud and how she taught at a public school. She attended a public school.
Wait, was it the song Public School Nation, Public School Proud?
I don't know. Okay. But so she started this hashtag and she said she sent her kids to public school. She said she taught at public school. And Education Week actually did a whole survey in May of 2019 where they asked all the candidates, where did you go to school and where did you send your kids to school? And what was interesting is most of the candidates did respond. Elizabeth Warren's campaign did respond as well, but they only responded to the question of where did you go to school? And she said, I went to public school. No comment on where I sent my kids to school.
She said no comment or just ignored it?
I don't know if she said no comment, but that's what Education Week reported.
Got it. Okay.
That they didn't respond when it came to the where she sent her
I'm being
kids.
pedantic, but I really want to be clear. Education Week highlighted that she did not respond to this part of the answer.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, but she did respond to the
other part of the answer.
To the
Okay,
I
yeah.
went to public school. So then I was thinking, really hard about this, and I was like, well, if she's so public school proud, wouldn't she be? And she's so proud about talking about how she went to a public school and how she taught at public school. Well, wouldn't she be super proud of saying that she sent her kids to public school because that was her decision? You can argue that her going to public school herself was more her parents' decision.
Sure.
So she would really want to capitalize on saying, I sent my kids to public school too because I believe in the public education system. Well, I went on to Ancestry.com that night and I found out...
She was Cherokee.
There's a lot of stuff she made up, but I found a picture of Alex Warren in a yearbook in Kirby Hall School. It was right next to UT, University of Texas Austin, where she was teaching at the time. And the tuition now is about $18,000 a year.
Is that high for public school? How does that compare?
In Texas, in Texas they spend less than that in their public schools.
No, but I mean tuition-wise, is that a fancy private school or is that a regular? Like, how does that compare? Do you know?
Compared to the average tuition of private schools across the nation, I think the average private school tuition is around $13,000 per year. So it's much higher percentage-wise than that. And then someone from the Federalist, I think Christy Clark, actually found a few days after I found that out that, or maybe it was a week afterwards. Who cares about how many days it was? But,
I care, Corey.
But someone leaked his yearbook photo at the Haverford School in Pennsylvania, which costs about $40,000 per year today.
Wow.
And so, look, I don't care if you send your kid to a private school. I think every family should pick the best educational options for their kids. And if that's a private school, that's great. If it's a magnet school, that's great. If it's a charter school option, that's great. If it's a homeschooling option, more power to you. But the big problem comes when Elizabeth Warren comes fighting as hard as possible against other people having similar educational options that she exercised for her own kids. And she did send one of her kids to a public schools all throughout, Amelia Warren. But that just highlights the need for school choice. I mean, one size does not fit all. For Warren's own family, public school was a good option for one student, whereas a private school option was a better option for another child.
So she's been called out on this to her face now.
And she lied in person on camera, and that blew up. If you look at my pinned tweet, that's still my pinned tweet, that someone from the Powerful Parent Network, it's a big group of, I think it's a relatively new group of parents who fight for school choice and accountability in
And this was an
public schools.
African-American woman who was yelling her in the video, correct?
Yes. So this was at a rally in Atlanta. And the rally was about, if you look at the speech that Warren gave, it was about empowering, Black women in particular. And this whole group was mostly African-American individuals and parents. And they started chanting, "My child, my choice,"
Really?
at her rally. And Warren didn't like that. And her other Warren fans didn't like that either. They tried to shout down the families who were shouting down Warren. And, they said, "My child, my choice." They had some other chants as well, but it was a pro-school choice chant. And afterwards, you got to give Warren credit. She met with a few of these individuals after her speech in Atlanta. And it was Howard Fuller, who has been in the school choice fight for a long time. He's been there since the Milwaukee voucher program started in 1990. So he's been in this school choice fight for about 3 decades or more. He really just destroyed all of her arguments in that discussion afterwards. And I think that Elizabeth Warren didn't expect it, because she was really getting owned in that conversation by Howard Fuller. She must have been thinking, this guy has a hoodie on. He probably doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'll meet with him afterwards. But Howard Fuller knows his stuff.
I'm a Harvard professor. I'm a senator.
Yeah, I'm Harvard. I can deal with this, right?
I got to tell you,
she stepped into something
she's
she
not
didn't
a dumb
want to
woman.
step into.
I don't think she's a dumb woman at all.
No, of course
but
not.
I do think she's very unsophisticated and sloppy and self-owns far more than you'd expect. Let me interrupt you for a second. Let's get a little personal. What has been your favorite school memory?
My favorite school memory is playing high school football in Texas. Had the whole Friday Night Lights scenario, playing in a huge stadium. So that was a lot of fun.
Were you a good player?
I think I was pretty good. I started.
Oh, that is pretty good.
That matters, yeah.
Okay.
I played college football for a little bit, just for
Oh.
one semester. It was nothing serious. It was a Division III college, a very small school with only like 1,000 students.
Were you a tight end?
Definitely not.
Well, I've seen photos to the contrary. Hey guys, I want to tell you about Beachbody On Demand, which is a really great idea to help you get in shape, which is obviously I'm a fan of. And you know what else? It's free. I'm a bigger fan of that. All you got to do is text Malice to 303030. That's 3 of them. 303030. Text Malice. You get access to the full platform for free. What are you going to find there? They've got a ton of trainers. They've got a ton of different programs depending on what you want to do. If you want to look lean, you want to get flexible, they've got yoga, they've got dance workouts, they've got bodybuilding stuff, they got weight training. Find a trainer who looks like you want to look like, follow their routines. It's going to be different stuff every day. They're going to have the videos there so you know how to do the movements. And this is a company that has a history of breaking out things like P90X, Insanity, 21-day fix. If you text Malice to 303030, 303030, you are going to get into better shape, which I heartily endorse. Let's get back to the show.
Well, in that conversation with Howard Fuller and the mom, who I'll get to in a second, Sarah Carpenter, I actually met Sarah Carpenter, and she lives in Tennessee. She has a group out there, a parent empowerment network out there. And I met with her when I did a debate on school choice at the University of Memphis. But the mom actually said to Elizabeth Warren, she's actually a grandmother now, hey, we actually got more money for our schools just pretty recently, and it looks like all the money's just going down the drain. Now you guys are asking us to raise taxes again and to spend more in our public schools. What'd you do with the money that we got you beforehand? And Elizabeth Warren responded nicely, I understand where you're coming from. When I was in Massachusetts, I actually told all of the workers at the child development centers that I would give them a 80% raise, but guess how much of a raise they actually got? A 0% raise, because all the money went to the government and didn't make it down to the teachers. That was Warren saying that. So she pretty much admitted in that video that her own education plan to just throw more money at the problem isn't going to actually do anything. It didn't work when she promised that it would work in Massachusetts. So she kind of did a cell phone there. But the worst part of that video, the part of the video that went viral, is when the mom, who read my New York Post article about Warren's kid actually going to a private school, asked Warren to her face, said, hey, we just want the same options that you had for your family, because I read that you sent your kids to private schools. Warren quickly replied, and very in a reserved fashion, replied, no, my kids went to public schools, which is, some people will say that's a white lie, a small lie, because she did send one kid to public school, Amelia, throughout the entire K-12 experience, but Alex Warren, starting in 5th grade, throughout the rest of the experience, went to private schools. So the majority of his time was in private schools, and it's a false denial.
But it is factual to say he did go to public school.
He did go to public schools,
kindergarten to 4.
But the mom's question was about private schools.
Yeah.
So you can argue all day and night whether this is a lie or not, but it's extremely misleading for
At
the mom
best.
to say you sent your kids to private schools, and then so it is actually a straight up lie because Warren said no.
Oh yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
false denial. That is a explicit lie when asked about private schools. When you say no, that implies that I didn't send my kids to private schools for any of their
Have
K
they
through 12
have they
experience.
acknowledged she acknowledged this that she was lying?
Yep, just like I think within a week after this whole video went viral on my Twitter and in other outlets, everybody was writing about it. The Warren campaign responded to Fox News, Washington Free Beacon, and several other outlets with the same canned response that Amelia Warren attended public schools. Alex Warren attended public schools until 5th grade. And so they didn't say,
Yeah.
yes, Warren lied, but they admitted what I found was actually Alex Warren's yearbook photo.
But this is what's so wonderful. It's that before social media, first of all, people wouldn't even really know about her plan,
Exactly.
or they would know about it, but they wouldn't really put two and two together how it's dangerous. And then you wouldn't be in a position, the mom, to confront her. That confrontation would not be public, and she wouldn't be forced to acknowledge her deception. So I'm so frustrated when people are on like, oh, everything's ruined. It's like, look,
It's better.
this would have been unimaginable 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's much easier to hold people accountable for not telling the truth, whether it's the media that we were talking about earlier when they were not issuing a correction or sitting on a correction for 8 days, or whether it comes to politicians. I think it's very beneficial to have social media. A lot of people are arguing that, look, social media is ruining our society, but in a lot of ways, it's making it a lot
It's
better.
saving our
It's
society.
saving it.
One of the things I would like to ask you to do when you, in the future, and I don't know if you do this already, I don't think you do, when you are working with, let's suppose, putting the Washington Post on blast, okay? Because this is going to happen again.
Yeah, of course.
Every time you do it, make it, because, it's like, it's not a TV show where you have to start watching from episode 1, right? People are going to start joining in every step of the journey. Point out earlier iterations. Last September, we had this argument, and you had a retraction. I see now you are making the same error. And every single time, add the Russian doll.
It's almost like we need to start a journalistic error map or something. Like start putting all these corrections onto a map of different outlets.
Sure, but I mean the point is to demonstrate to the casual observer, the third party, that at a certain point, everything's marginal, right? At a certain point, someone will see 2 iterations. They'll be like, okay, this is a lie. Someone is going to have to take 100. But if you keep building those iterations, eventually everyone's going to realize, oh, these are not mistakes. And
Right.
they're going to feel embarrassed at the very least, because it's like, okay, he's demonstrating a pattern using our own words.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, because if you just see a one-off tweet
Right.
or a one-off correction and you're just now, starting to tune into my corrections of these false claims, you're right. It won't convince a lot of people, but if they see the pattern, people will start to understand what's actually going on.
Right. So there was one example, which was the first time you crossed my desk, when you were going back and forth with a reporter from, I believe, a Philly paper.
Philly Inquirer.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, that one was a very similar claim to what was made in the Washington Post. It's a little different because the Washington Post was an opinion piece, and I still think that's something that should have been caught, especially if it's the dean of the education school.
Wait, and let me interrupt you again, because we hear on social media all the time, oh, social media is being used to spread misinformation, and politicians lie, and these corporations have to call them accountable. You are repeating a lie in your opinion page, and you're not highlighting it. You're just letting it run.
Yeah, we need to hold people accountable, even if it's an opinion piece. Just because it's an opinion piece doesn't mean you shouldn't fact check it,
Right.
And that it's still gonna. People look at it as the Washington Post. They don't
Correct.
look at it. Oh, this is Dean Pianta. We should let the Washington Post off the hook. But the Inquirer piece was a similar claim. I don't remember the exact claim because I've corrected so many of these, but it was about education spending and how it has increased in real terms over time, which it hasn't. They repeated what was said in the Washington Post, and I dug up the data in Pennsylvania as well because they could have argued, well, maybe in Pennsylvania it decreased over time. No, there were large increases in Pennsylvania as well. So I dug up all those data, showed them. They were much better about it. And this was a reporter this time. It wasn't an opinion writer. It was an actual reporter. I don't think it was an education reporter, but that doesn't matter. It was still a reporter that should have checked this instead of just buying the narrative that they've heard before. And they got back to me within like a couple of hours on Twitter, and they corrected it. And I tweeted right away, like, props to you guys for correcting this, within a few hours.
Wait, what had they said earlier, and what was the correction?
So the first one was education spending has decreased over the last few decades.
Okay.
That's what they said. And then they corrected it. It wasn't an actual correction. I thought it was at first, and I congratulated them, which I deleted that tweet right away when I found out what their correction was. Their correction said they just changed the words from the last few decades to in the last decade. They said that education spending has decreased in the last decade. That wasn't true either. I dug up the data in Pennsylvania and at the national level and said, your correction needs a correction. And then that one took it took more than the typical couple of hours, and then they actually corrected it.
To what?
They kept the same narrative that whatever it was. I don't remember the thrust of the essay, but I remember they kept the same narrative, but they still corrected the statement and said that funding is actually increased in Pennsylvania. But they still made their same argument anyway, which goes to show that it's about the narrative. The data isn't driving the narrative. It's you have the narrative first, you write your thing, and
You're
find the
stealing
data
my line
to support it. You're right. I mean, look.
This is I'll say this how I always say it. There's a difference between a bias and an agenda. A bias is you have the facts and then you interpret it secondarily. An agenda is
like, yep.
the facts are secondary and the agenda is primary. And we're seeing it here. Literally, if I'm making a claim based on a data going in one direction, and I have been given information, which I acknowledged, that the data is going in the complete opposite direction, which I had believed, let's pretend I believed, and I still do not change the consequences of the argument I was making based on the data, that demonstrates this is an agenda.
Yeah,
which is independent of reality and data.
This has happened in the Washington Post and the Philly Inquirer. It was the same thing. They corrected it to say that spending actually increased, but then they kept the same exact narrative. That's why I argued after the corrections that this should have actually been retracted because your whole point is moot now, or you should have changed the whole article and made a different argument.
And what they say?
They didn't. And what I thought was also strange with the Philly Inquirer piece is it didn't at first they didn't note like this was corrected from this to this, and usually you want them to write that so they can hold themselves accountable in some way at least. They didn't make any note of it at first. I think they now have a note after I complained about it a million times. Yeah, I did. I started blasting them on Twitter saying, is it standard practice not to note a major correction like this? And they weren't responding. And then I think after either a week or some amount of time, they actually did note the correction at the very end of the piece. I think it should be at the top. If you make an error, own it, right?
No, I think that's I think editorial practice you put at the end. That's the norm, is my understanding.
Kudos to them for actually, putting it at some point.
So I'm going to start playing devil's advocate, okay? Homeschooling. What's going to happen when you have parents who are members of a cult and they teach their kids wacky stuff, and then that kid is not going to be prepared to have a job?
Yeah, so this is the exception proving the rule that's made against an argument that's made against homeschooling. I can just as easily say, well, look at this government-run school where people aren't learning anything. They're not learning anything, or they're getting involved with gang activities or drug activities or violence or sexual activities. And I can say, if you apply that kind of logic to the traditional public school system, then we should also not have government-run schools either. So if you're going to make that argument against homeschooling, then I'm going to make that argument right back at you in the traditional government-run school system. But again, it's using the exception to prove the rule. If you look at the homeschooling evidence, it's overwhelmingly in favor of homeschooling. It's not that very rigorous, the evidence, because you're not randomly assigned to homeschool or not homeschool. But from the most rigorous evidence that we have on homeschooling, it looks like kids are actually doing better. And then we also have systems in place currently like CPS. I mean, I have mixed views about CPS because sometimes you could take away a child that You could have a false negative, for example, or false positive, where you take away someone who, oops, I shouldn't actually taken away this child. But that's not a school choice issue. That is a, how much power should CPS have issue. It's not a homeschooling issue.
Okay, here's the other one. If we are going to have one nation with one shared culture in whatever sense, if we do not have a basis of belief and ideology, we're not going to be able to have a country going forward. And the only way to have that system of belief and agreement is to have a strong public school system.
That's the whole argument behind the public school system when it started in, the compulsory education law in 1852 in Massachusetts with Horace Mann. This was the thrust of his whole argument that, look, we have all these immigrants coming in. We got to teach them how to be proper American citizens.
By the way, they're also coming in from Scandinavia. So the first racists were against the Lutherans who were teaching Norwegian and Swedish. These were not Mexicans. These are not Italians. These are not my people.
It was an anti-Catholic movement in the United States. This is a well-known history of the public school movement in the United States. This isn't disputed that the public school system was made to make those crazy Catholic peoples, in quotes, more American. What they meant by more American was more Protestant. The KKK made the same argument in Oregon when they tried to outlaw private schooling altogether in 1922. They actually succeeded in outlawing private schooling altogether in Oregon.
The Klan did this?
They were behind it. They weren't the only people behind it, but they were on the side of outlawing private schools to make everybody, again, more real American citizens, whatever the Klan thought that actually meant at the time.
Wait, the Klan were for the public schools?
Yes, they wanted to outlaw private schools.
Private schools. You said public. Okay.
Got to make. They wanted to outlaw private schools, and then in 1925, thankfully, the Supreme Court of the United States struck that down, that stupid law down in 1925. Took 3 years, but that was Pierce versus Society of Sisters, 1925. These arguments have been made for a very long time. But if you look at the civic outcome evidence of school choice, there have been 3 reviews of this evidence, and it's all pretty clear that when people get to choose their schools, they have better civic outcomes. So they're more tolerant of other people's views. And that might be because they're taught more logic, right? I think a lot of the people I argue with on Twitter who happen to be employees of the public school system, they go straight to ad hominem and attack my funding or just attack me as a person. They don't respond to my arguments with logic. And if kids are learning these logical fallacies on a daily basis, that shouldn't surprise us that we have a more and more polarized society each and every day. A lot of people that originally made these arguments for the public school system thought about the public school system that they wished we would have instead of looking at what actually happens when you don't have competitive pressures. When you don't have competitive pressures, well, then you don't do a good job at shaping American citizens either.
I think it's now that you say this, there's few things that are harder, that are better at making kids hate America and the government than putting them in a government school. It's like if you want someone to love driving, don't put them at the DMV.
Yeah, exactly. I was looking into this earlier before I got here, but if you just go on a Google search, just people at home do it right now. If you type in schooling or school makes me, and you know how Google will finish your sentences, all the top searches are schooling makes me sad, schooling makes me suicidal, schooling makes me want to kill myself. Do it right now, people that are watching at home. If you just type into Google. Don't talk to the audience. You can do it right now. You got your laptop.
You do not tell me what to do.
Do it if you want to later on.
Yes. Choice. School
exactly,
search choice.
Boom. Yeah. So, not telling you have to. I'm not going to come to your house and rob your stuff and throw you in jail if you don't. But I think it would be beneficial if you would, so that you can fact check me. But that's what shows up. So yeah, if you want people to love the government, don't do that in the school system, because a lot of people just don't like the school system. They don't like their schooling experiences all that much because it seems like, it seems kind of like a prison-like environment. You have to go there every day. You have to pay for it. If you want to get out of it, you have to go through homeschooling regulations, and a lot of parents don't have time or the money to do that. So it is a very compulsory system, which people associate with a prison-like environment. Some schools even actually have metal detectors and random dog sniffs. This isn't the environment that we want kids.
So you disagree with my quote, my very famous quote?
No, I agree with it.
Well, you just said prison-like. Well, my quote, for those who don't know, is public schools are literal prisons for children and the only place many people will encounter violence in their lifetimes.
and I've made some similar tweets as well. It's a little bit different from a prison because the kids aren't even guilty; they're innocent.
Well, so many prisoners. To be fair, they're not guilty of real crimes, and they're not guilty of what they're charged with.
And I mean, the good thing is that you can get out of the school system if you want. You are compelled to have an education, but you can kind of get around compulsory education laws with homeschooling laws. But there are some states that have more regulations on homeschooling, which is an issue. But we can get around that issue with homeschooling. But again, you still have to pay for the government-run school system, whether you send your kids there or not. So a lot of people, like 82% of families just use that default option. They figure, I'm already paying for it. I'm just going to send them to that government-run school all day.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Let's get a little personal. What has been your favorite school memory?
My favorite school memory is after I would finish a test, I would yell out, "Got 100."
Is that true?
In the middle of the class, I would call out my grade before I got my grade back. People didn't like me for doing that very much.
Were the call outs accurate?
Most of the time, but I would say it even if I wasn't going to get 100.
Okay. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. I want to tell you about Ridge. What is Ridge? It's a really cool wallet that was launched on Kickstarter in 2013. Now they got over 500,000 sold. Your old wallet sucks. What this is, it's two metal plates bound together by a durable elastic band. It looks nothing like a traditional wallet. It looks really, really cool. They've got titanium options, they've got carbon fiber, and they've got aluminum options. There's something for everyone. It's got 30,000 5-star reviews, and it's a better way to carry your cash and your cards. And you know what? You don't like it? Free returns, lifetime warranty. If you go to ridge.com and use promo code Malice, you get 10% off of your order. I love how they look. You don't want that George Costanza wallet where you're sitting in your back pocket and you're leaning halfway. And I also love the idea that this is something that they did on Kickstarter, which is how I got my start with Dear Reader. So if you go to ridge.com and use promo code Malice, you get 10% off of your order. It's really sleek. All that, and it's a good way to get rid of all that crap you have in your wallet. You know what I do? Take a picture of things, and then you're saving yourself space. And you know what? If you have a hard wallet, for you denim fans, you're going to get a nice fade on your pocket. Pocket fades are the first things to kick in, and they're really fun. If you go to ridge.com, promo code Malice, you get 10% off of your order. Let's get back to the show. It's also kind of amazing how, in economics, we learn about the laws of supply and demand, and price being a function of supply and demand, or where they meet those curves. And ostensibly, if you have a product that is of value, and you're getting it, for free, that people would still pay 20 grand extra to not have that product and have an alternative product, that is very, very telling. Like if I give you, most people, you could have as many of this car as you want.
Exactly.
For free, or you could have to pay 20 grand for this other car. It's like, yeah, I'll have 1 million of these cars.
Yeah, I use that same analogy all the time.
But it only works with cars.
Yeah, just so imagine if government was creating cars that were extremely expensive. Let's just say they were $50,000 to make, and just imagine trying to sell, being a private business selling cars. It would be really difficult to exist at all. So that we have 10% of kids in private schools today, and about 3 or 4% of the population in homeschooling situations, that tells you how bad the government-run school system is, because we're spending a ton of money. We spend, on average in the U.S., about $15,000 per pupil every year, and we still have people, sometimes low-income families, going to religious-based private schools or other types of low-cost private school options, or even homeschooling options, still going out of their way to get their children out of these schools, because a lot of the times these schools do more harm than good. A lot of people talk about socialization at school and why school is necessary because of socialization, but they never point out all the negative things going on at schools, like a lot of teen pregnancies can result from being around a lot of younger people your age and not supervised as much. You can get into drugs and gang activity. Not saying I'm anti-drug or anything, but at a very young age that could be problematic if you start engaging in illegal activities.
My big issue is the how it validates violence, because the argument often is, well, kids are going to be violent. And I'm like, well, kids are also going to shit their pants, right? So at a certain point, you teach them not to be violent. And why is my child who is trapped in a school with these kids who are violent? There's absolutely no reason for this. And this kind of kids will just be kids is nonsensical, because teens will just be teens doesn't mean, you're going to turn your head and everyone's just going to be fucking each other all the time and getting high all the time.
Yeah, and this is another one of your famous quotes, right? Schools are one of the places where
many people will experience violence in their lives. Yeah, and I've had this on Twitter where some people are like, well, we need a little violence to get the kids to toughen up. Even if I wrap my head around that argument, let's pretend that's true, right? Like, whatever.
We need to torture people in order, because it's good for them to overcome, issues. Right?
But also the argument that, like, there's a very big difference between I got my ass kicked in a fight, now I'm a man, I know what that's like. I can wrap my head around that. That's not the same as I have to, on a daily basis, be locked in a building with my tormentor who has had no consequences for what he did to me as a child, and I have to have this be my life. Those are not the same thing, and it's not the same that, as an adult, you're going to have to deal with someone getting in your face. As an adult, you will never be in a situation where all year you have to be side by side with this person who, committed violence against you.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the biggest reasons why people like school choice programs. And if you survey families, like in Florida, for example, Lindsey Burke and Jason Bedrick did a survey of over 13,000 families using their private school choice program. It's an education savings account program. And they just asked them, why did you choose this particular school over the other schools? And they rank safety at very high ends of the list, whereas they rank things like standardized test scores at the very bottom. And that makes sense if you think of it from a parent's perspective.
Yes.
Parents care about the safety of their children more than anyone else, especially if their kids are in a school where they're getting bullied all the time, or if they're getting into fights. I mean, when I was in middle school, for example, I went to a government-run middle school in Texas. It was cool to get into fights. You were the cool kid if you won the fight, right? So it's kind of incentivized, I think, in some environments, not all environments.
I think it's out. Go finish your thought.
And they found that safety was one of the biggest roles in the decision-making process. And so Florida now actually has a Hope Scholarship Program. It is a private school choice program in Florida, and it's for victims of bullying. So there's not you have to go through some paperwork and stuff for getting bullied in the government-run schools, but essentially, if you're bullied, you can get a voucher to go to a private school.
I think the bullying is inseparable from the system, and here's why. I think the bullies are the teachers. I think the goal of schools is explicitly to make good citizens, right? And that's a very Orwellian term, because you hear this, you're like, who would be against good citizenship, right? What that means is you're breaking these young children and making them obedient and submissive to that figure at the front of the room who is, maybe you can't say it, I certainly can, inevitably a mediocre person and not almost never an accomplished person who often gets off on their sense of power over these children. And that is a very, very dangerous lesson. And that is a way to make a population that is submissive and deferential to authority.
Yeah, if you read John Taylor Gatto,
yes,
he
course.
Recently passed away, and I wish he was still with us. He wrote all about this history of the public school system. If you look at the Prussian school system, it was created to create obedient soldiers in Prussia, and so Horace Mann went over there in the 1830s and brought that system to the United States, starting in Massachusetts in 1852. But I will say, I don't like to blame anyone in the system. I don't think it's the employee's fault. I think it's the system's fault that makes it as difficult as possible for high-quality teachers.
Well, that's because you like Milton Friedman and you're a Stalinist.
Let's agree to disagree on
I don't agree with that.
But look, I mean, teachers do have it as hard as possible in the current government-run school system. They have to deal with a bunch of kids who a lot of them don't want to be there. They're just forced to be there because of compulsory education laws. And they're only grouped based on their age and where they live, not based on their interests, ability levels. So we make the job as difficult as possible for teachers. But I think it's the system. And I do think a lot of how the system does work today, does go back to those roots of creating obedient citizens. Because, I mean, look, I have to raise my hand whenever I want to go to the restroom, for example. why is that the case? When I'm in college, I get to just leave and use the restroom. Why do I have to raise my hand? And then you get, you get diagnosed as ADHD if you don't pay attention and if you're not obedient 100% of the time.
Well, there's also something, when something is, like we all have our weird families, right? And it takes us to reach a certain age, and you're like, oh, wait, this isn't universal. It's just my family's weird. We just accept it. At any relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, you're going to have things that you come to accept as normal. Then you leave, you're like, wait a minute, how did we, end up in this situation? The idea that you're sitting in a room and you're learning, which is of value. First of all, it's not the case that everyone learns in the same way by sitting and listening to someone talk. That's insane. Different people learn very differently. This is no one.
I think most people don't learn.
I agree.
Way.
I certainly don't.
If I just look back to my educational experience, college and K through 12, I wasn't learning when I was sitting in front of the teacher. I learned at home, and then I looked like the smart kid because I had read all the stuff before I got to class, and then so I could answer the questions the professors were asking even before when they were thinking about asking them. So I looked like I was learning the stuff in class, but I think a lot of people learn when they're researching stuff themselves. If you just think about how we learn these days when we're out of school, we look on YouTube, we watch other people's videos, we read books. I think that's how people naturally learn.
But then, if I'm there to learn, which is commendable, right, ostensibly, I have to have this person at the front of the room tell me through grades whether I have learned or not. I have to take a test on it instead of, knowing what I know. And there's something to it because a lot of times we can mislearn things or misunderstand things. Fine. Also, this is a very idea that gets people ready for corporate America, which I'm very mixed feelings about, even as someone who's a hardcore defender of capitalism. The idea that your time is not your own and it belongs to the company. You worked at Goldman Sachs in a past life, and when I wouldn't want to do overtime, and it made no sense to them. Like, it wasn't like they thought I was being an asshole. They're like we're paying you time and a half. And I would say, I would prefer that hour to that time and a half, when they're like, but we need you for this project. I'm like, I don't care. It made no sense to them. And this is what homework is. So I'm there 8 hours a day. I'm free. I go home. It's my time. No, now you have to invade my time at home as much as it takes. And if I don't do what you want, I'm going to have severe consequences.
Yeah, and in a big sense, if you look at this kind of argument, there's a lot that Marxists can get behind against the compulsory nature of the government-run school system. I think Kevin Curry Knight, he's a professor. I don't remember where he's at right now, but he writes a lot about school choice and unschooling, and he kind of did a history of the arguments that Marxists have made against the government-run school system. They see it as corporate America, training people to be factory workers, and then he sees the libertarian arguments for against compulsory education and the current system that we have today, just because of the compulsory nature of it. So a lot of the left and the right, or big government and small government types, I think, can get behind this idea that we need more freedom in education.
Two devil's advocate questions. One is, okay, you have school choice. What ends up happening is you cherry pick the quality kids, the smart kids, whatever, and what you're left with is a nightmare because all the kids who have problems are now locked in a school together and the teachers can't have control over them, instead of kind of spreading it out, and that way everyone has a chance.
Yeah, I have a few different responses to this one because this is the one that's levied most often. But the thing is that if you look at the private school choice programs today, they're almost all of them are targeted to the least advantaged students, either based on their special needs status, based on their income levels, or based on whether they were assigned to a lower quality government-run school. So if you just look at the populations who are using these programs, it tends to be the least advantaged, not the most advantaged. And then also the government-run schools are working the least well for the least advantaged members of society, just like other government services. So school choice benefits the least advantaged more than anyone else. And I've done a review of this evidence on this topic that people will make the argument that, yeah, we get it that the least advantaged are the ones that are eligible for these programs, but maybe the more advantaged of that disadvantaged group are using the programs. I've reviewed this evidence at Education Next. If you just Google vouchers tend to serve the less advantaged, well, there's the answer for you. Most of this evidence is pretty mixed, but if you had to call it one way or another, even out of that disadvantaged group of students, it tends to be the less advantaged of those disadvantaged groups, so the very least advantaged that tend to be using these programs. And the reason for that is because the least advantaged have the strongest incentive to get out of their schools, their government-run schools, because they tend to be the ones that are stuck in the worst government-run schools. If you're an advantaged kid and the public school is working for you, there's no reason to leave. And, transitioning schools is a very costly endeavor, and you have to get associated with new friends. But then also, there's two more responses I have to this. One is that the traditional public schools actually financially benefit when they lose students to school choice. A lot of people don't realize this because they hear the opposite, right? They hear that you're draining money from public schools. Well, first of all, the reality is that the government schools are the ones that are draining money from families. It's not that school choice is just returning the money to their rightful owners. But schools in the United States are funded based on enrollment counts, but they're not completely funded based on enrollment counts. The percentage change is different by each state, but I think it's around 60 to 80% in that realm. But that means when I leave the government-run school, that government-run school gets to keep 20 to 40% of the funding. So on a per pupil basis, they end up with more money per child left behind. So they actually financially benefit. It's kind of like if I left Walmart because I didn't like their groceries because it just kind of suck at groceries, and I went to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, Walmart would actually be pretty happy if they got to keep 20 to 40% of my grocery bill each week. They shouldn't get to keep any of it. They should get to keep none of it, which is actually how it works in the food service system. I should be able to take, if I'm using food stamps, all of those food stamps to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods. That Walmart shouldn't get to keep any of that money. But with the public school system, they get to keep 20 to 40%. So they should be grateful that they get to keep any money at all. And then lastly, there's a very large body of evidence on this particular question. There's 28 studies on this. Just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, a study by out of Florida actually looked at the competitive effects of private school choice on the kids left behind in the public schools. And they found large positive effects on the kids left behind, particularly for the least advantaged students. So 26 of these 28 studies now find these statistically significant positive effects for the kids left behind because the public schools know they got to shape up or shut down. A lot of times they don't shut down. I mean, if you look in Chicago, for example, there's schools that have, most recently, I've seen a report of a school that was built for 1,000 students, but only has 58 students, and it's still up and running in Chicago. So a lot of times they don't shut down. But look, if you have a stronger incentive to do a better job, those kids who remain in your school actually are better off.
Here's another devil's advocate question. What about if we don't have public schools, then everyone's going to be illiterate? We have to fix the system we have.
So I want to make one more response to the previous question.
Okay.
Although the evidence shows that the competitive effects are positive and that they financially benefit, that shouldn't worry anyone, right? So like, just imagine if we applied this to groceries like I do with every other argument. If I go from Whole Foods to Trader Joe's, I don't think to myself, this is going to hurt Trader Joe's. This isn't going to fix Whole Foods. What matters is, am I getting the service that I want? Right. It's not up to me. It's not my responsibility for Whole Foods to get better when I leave.
It's about the kids or about the groceries. It's not about the actual organization.
Yeah, exactly. And so like no one should be able to force me to go back to Whole Foods if Whole Foods doesn't get any better. That's on them. They need to get better. And what actually what we tend to find in the literature is those schools actually do get better. So without public schools, so the next argument is without public schools, everybody will be illiterate.
Yeah.
But the public schools aren't creating a literate society right now. So we might as well have a system that gives individual schools incentives to do a good job. I never really call for abolishing all public schools altogether. I call for more incremental reforms like private school vouchers and tax credit scholarships and education savings accounts and charter schools sometimes as well. If that leads to the abolition of public schools, we should all ask ourselves why that would lead to the abolition of public schools. So when people are making this argument about school choice is going to destroy public education or public schools, my first response is always, well, why do you think it would destroy public schools? And the answer that they never give me, what I think the answer is in their minds, is that they know that the private schools are doing a better job. And what's interesting to point out here is that voucher programs in the U.S. and all these private school choice programs and charter school programs, in the most part, they get less money than what would have been spent in the public schools. So people are voluntarily voting with their feet to private schools while getting fewer education dollars each year. And so these schools are doing a better job, as evidenced by people voting with their feet at a lower cost. So yeah, I mean, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, that school choice isn't anti-public schools or anti-government schools. It's just pro-choice and pro-freedom. I don't care what type of school you pick. I just want people to have the option. If it turns out in 10 years after we have universal school choice, I don't know if we'll have it at that point, but if we did, 10 years later, if I see that our system still has 82% of kids in government-run schools, I would be okay with that as long as it's a voluntary choice made by individuals.
Well, what about this devil's advocate argument? Let me interrupt you for a second. Let's get a little personal. What has been your favorite school memory?
So my one favorite school memory that I like to share with a lot of people is that I used to actually get bullied a little bit in middle school, even though I was, I played sports and stuff, but I would get bullied for not walking like I had a limp, so not walking cool enough. I walked too straight up. And so that was one of those things that happened, like one of those things I like to think about in middle school. And then also, I wasn't in a gang, so that was seen as not cool at my middle school. And so the way that people got into gangs in my middle school is they get beat up in the bathroom, they get rolled into the gang. So I like to share that example because it's something I think about a lot when people talk about how socialization in schools is always a good thing, but it isn't necessarily always a good thing.
Yeah, let me get a little personal. You have ad hominem a lot on Twitter, right? What people say, you're a shill, you're this or that. What is it like being a hunk?
What? Oh, no. Yeah, so that's from like 5-6 years ago. So you're doing one of these too. I just talked to Robert Patton.
Yeah. Is it?
Yeah, so
what's it like being a hunk?
Oh, I mean, I wish I was still buff like that. I'm not buff like that anymore. But yeah, so yeah, one of your sponsors is Sheath Underwear.
That's
correct?
right.
Yes.
We're gonna cut to the ad right now. Hey guys, Michael Malice here. Yeah, I want to talk to you about Sheath Underwear. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order. All my underwear now is Sheath, and I'm a big fan of theirs. What it does is they've got a separate pouch for your one part of your genitals and another part of your genitals. It sounds insane, and when they first brought it down to Gas Digital, I'm like, what is this? And now, as I just said, I only wear Sheath because it's so fun, it's so comfortable, and I gotta tell you, there's a little element of subversion when you wear them. And they look great, and they make your glutes look superb. They've also got women's stuff, and they've got great t-shirts, which I wear to the gym. In fact, my hair right now looks like their logo. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you get 20% off your order. They're always coming out with new lines. So like now they've got this cool camo one. They've gone that's black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow. They've got a black and red one. It's really fun. It's kind of, I don't even know what it's made of, but it's kind of the spandexy thing. So it breathes and it's super comfortable. Athletes are big fans of this, especially people who do marathons and stuff where you get sweaty. That's not my jam. Ladies glow. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice20, you will get 20% off your order. Now let's get back to the show. Are you engaged?
Will be pretty soon. So we've been wearing these rings for about 5 years now.
Yeah, because it's very sparkly.
With my girlfriend. Yeah, this is my girlfriend's. We've been together 5 years, and I just went and purchased an engagement ring. She knows about it, so if she watches this won't be a surprise to her.
Well, we don't allow women to watch this show.
I haven't heard of that.
Well, I assure you.
I'll show it to her. But yeah, so that'll be coming actually pretty soon. But yeah, I get that question a lot, whether I'm married or engaged. But yeah, we've been very close for a long time, and I feel like I'm engaged already.
Are you gonna propose to her at the Cato Winter Garden?
No, it's not gonna happen.
Not a Cato.
I won't go over the specific details of when or or how I'm going to propose, because she'll probably see this. So
Is
I
it
want to keep it a secret.
Friedman's grave?
No.
That's where love goes to be born. Corey, we're out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Well, I mean, it's really good to meet you in person. We've been, friends on social media for a while now, or at least acquaintances on social media for a while now. And I like the discussion. I like how you throw in the devil's advocate questions. You don't just sit here and agree with me all the time, even though we agree on most things, but you'll press me when you disagree with something I say. So I really like that about your show, and I like that about our discussion today.
You are welcome.